This theory of everything is about the unification of opposites. It also includes a universal formula which brings evolution, morality, structures, mathematics, ideologies, states of matter, states of mind, perception, temperatures, religion and more under one single pattern. It is a metaphysical theory from a software developer's perspective. It is not about CERN and the so-called God particle. It is not about looking into total detail. We are looking at the big picture from so far above that physics and quantum mechanics actually play only a minor role. Here I will view the mind as an algorithm, a logical sequence of processing information whose judgments are influenced by evolution and experience. It is a cold look into the mental archetypes, so cold that the human mind seems to be nothing more than a complex calculator, processes which simply happen out of themselves. So it is not exactly what many understand under metaphysics. Science is about finding knowledge and recognizing reality. For this you have to be open, but also critical. Because if you are open but not critical, you become too naive. And if you are critical but not open, you become too dismissive to take new information. Knowledge acquisition is a 0 point from which one can move in two directions into ignorance. The two external elements can cooperate with each other in a duality. For example, through an arrogant cult leader and his naive followers, but also in a single individual mind. Arrogant rejection is perfect as a psychological defense mechanism to maintain a naive and false understanding of reality. I want to make clear that I do not claim to know everything or that I would always be right. I am working on the theory alone and I have made the experience that nobody really wants to know. That's why I hardly get any feedback, which in turn increases the probability of making mistakes. I am not perfect and I'm constantly learning. I noticed a pattern in political ideas at some point. Equality relates to order as freedom relates to chaos. Equality is also something fixed and bound, and when something is free, it always means that something is different from each other. So I wandered from one abstraction to another, while the pattern through which these abstractions move always remained the same. In the end, I was able to answer myself one question. What is the nature of our reality? As I have noticed, there's great division on this question. Is it deterministic and everything follows in order? Is there a path for everyone? Or is everything simply the product of nothing but chaotic accidents? Order, chaos, or a third option. Instead of choosing one side, we could also try to unite them. Let's take the structure of a tree. No tree is an exact copy of another. But we can differentiate trees from elephants because the structure of a tree follows certain laws. The structure of a tree is not order or chaos, but a centered synthesis. This can also be proven by removing one of these essences. If we take the chaos out of the tree, its structure becomes more static. The lengths and angles in the structure are no longer variable but fixed. A sameness of values. The way it looks on one place is the way it looks in another place. If, on the other hand, we would take the order out of the tree, there would be no laws, nothing that could hold the tree together. It would be not only variable in mathematical values, but also lawless and unpredictable. All of this is a spectrum, which can be understood better if we split the two essences into 4 elements. Now we already have a formula. This is made out of a prima materia, our primordial essence, the sum of all things, in this case the sum of all possible structures. Then we have 2 essences, order and chaos. These are broken down into 4 elements, which can then be combined into the 3 principles. This is not only a formula with which we can better understand the possibilities of structures, but we can also analyze the nature of mathematics. Equality in law means a mathematical equation. The Pythagorean theorem describes universal and constant relations. But there's an infinite set of possible values that could be calculated with it. The mathematical equation is fixed and the mathematical values are variable. Objective laws and subjective values. One could also misunderstand mathematics. For example, that the nature of mathematical numbers lie in an equality. Then 1 plus 1 would be 1, which reminds a little of esoteric numerology. One could also believe that there are no mathematical laws. From this perspective, the result of 1 plus 1 could also be 3. It is like the belief that all mathematical laws are subjective and 1 plus 1 only results in 2 because we have collectively agreed on it. If we would simulate our reality, then we need for it, of course, the mathematics to calculate the events. On lawlessness and numerology, one cannot build a simulation. Everything that has already been calculated in a simulation is in the past, and what has not yet been calculated is in the future. The process of calculation is a happening moment. Also in the time, we find the essences of order and chaos. Because past events are fixed, cannot be changed and will remain eternally in the past. Future events are undefined until they are calculated. Any point in time that is defined in the future is only in the future for a limited time, until it happens, and then it will remain eternally in the past. Let us apply the formula to potential realities and assume there is a hyperreality in which a multitude of realities happen side by side, which can function according to all possible principles and laws. In different realities, future events can be predicted with different accuracy. In a static reality, future events are exactly predictable, because it always produces the same results. Since nothing deviates in such a reality, nothing will be able to develop. An organic reality works with probabilities. The closer an event is, the more accurate it can be predicted. The further one looks into the future, the larger the quantity of potential possibilities becomes. In a total chaotic reality, new unbound and completely random values emerge with every calculation. Therefore, a chaotic reality is too unstable for life to be brought into existence. Only in the middle of possible realities life can develop, by evolution. This functions after certain inheritance principles whose possibilities lie in the same pattern as the sum of all possible realities. If every generation is an exact copy of the parents, the future developments are exactly predictable. There is no development then. Values remain the same. A static inheritance principle can therefore not produce life. Likewise, if the deviations are too high, the development would be too unstable and functioning characteristics would not be passed on reliably. An organic inheritance principle, which works with copies with small deviations, is the only principle which allows evolutionary development to take place at all. In the formula, there's another synthesis. This can be represented better if we arrange the elements in a square with 2 dimensions. For simplification, the elements also got their own symbol, which I have taken over from alchemy. The opposite of static is chaotic. The opposite of an organic order is a constructed order. So something that is artificially constructed. Art, for example, or a constructed bicycle, or a computer game. When a computer game is programmed, artificial laws are written to create a specific game mechanic. It is chosen beforehand what a game should be about and what it should look like. Then algorithms are written to create this reality as a game experience. So you write laws to generate certain events and values, for example, values of colors or the size of the game character and how to control it. In the development, you change the code until the values behave as they should and no more bugs occur. The laws that control a computer game are fixed for the game, but they are not fixed in a universal and archetypal understanding. They can only apply if there is a constructing individual. Laws of nature can be found everywhere independently, but there will be no other planet in a distant galaxy that has finally found the laws that are used in Dark Souls, so that they experience the same game. The metaphysics of a constructed order stands inverted to the natural order. In nature, the law is universal and the value is variable. In the constructed order, one works with variable laws to generate selected states and values. Applied to evolution, a constructed synthesis means selective breeding. Natural selection works decentrally and with variable properties. Artificial selection, on the other hand, is centrally planned. The breeder takes the freedom to invent new consequences, which direct the natural development in the direction he desires. He overcomes the laws of evolution by external force, in order to prefer or to punish characteristics declared by him as true or false. Life, which develops evolutionary and begins to question reality, will always observe an organic reality. In such an organic reality, all the possible structures and states can be brought into existence. Fixed to volatile states of matter, for example. I have also added the 4 elements earth, water, air and fire. The formula which is used here already exists in the Hermetic philosophy, and it is called the Philosopher's Stone. It is not really a stone. It is called so because the formula describes unchanging archetypes through which life evolves. Everything we observe in the physical world is temporary, but the laws of existence are eternal. The left elements are cold and fixed, and the right elements are warm and fleeting. The inner elements provide a moisture that is life-friendly, the outer elements a dryness that is hostile to life. When we look for higher life in space, we do not look for it in hot suns or in rocks that are too cold, but we look for planets that are in the middle. Planets which are not too hot and not too cold, optimally with water and an atmosphere. Because if the environment is too static, no movement can happen, and if it's too chaotic, everything would decay too fast. This is a metaphysical theory. Here it is neither about the physics nor about quantum physics. I am not a physicist, and therefore I cannot tell much about the elementary physical basic forces. I would be much more interested in what physicists think about the idea, because I noticed that I can arrange the forces like the 4 alchemist elements from order to chaos. Wholeness, eternity, predictability on one side, and detail, short range, and unpredictability on the other. I wondered what would happen if things were different. If there were no randomness on a small scale, then reality might be too static to produce life, and if it were chaotic on the large scale as well, everything would immediately fall apart. If all hypothetical realities with all possible natural forces and natural laws would coexist and happen side by side, then nothing exciting would happen in most of them. No life arises which could observe these realities. Whenever life observes its reality, it will always be orderly on the large scale and chaotic on the small scale. Probabilities become more and more deterministic the more events take place. If a player in a casino will win 48% of the time, it does not mean that 48% of all casinos will go broke. In the sum of many games, the casino always wins. The spectrum of order and chaos is also found in laminar and turbulent flow. Likewise, frequencies are in the spectrum of slow and fast, stillness and motion. The spectrum from order to chaos is like another dimension. It reminds me of a string theory, and I wonder if the dimension of the strings could extend over such a spectrum. Here, however, as I said, it is not about physics, but about a universal pattern which is superior to mind and matter. Metaphysics is not the same as physics. Philosophy and morality is not the same as biology and sexuality. Alchemy and archetypal elements is not the same as chemistry and the periodic table. Metaphysics is something mental, so it is an esoteric science. Physics is something physical, so it is an exoteric science. Both are scientific, but they can be practiced unscientifically. Since this is about metaphysics, this is also an esoteric theory. Here it is about the sum of all hypothetical possibilities which flow into each other. So concepts like order and chaos, negative and positive, altruism and egoism, or socialism and capitalism are not binary, but connected by a spectrum. In the physical world it looks different. There we find things which are dual, separated from each other. Sun and moon are 2 separate celestial bodies. We are also not all physically connected with each other, but separated individuals. There is also a duality of biological sexes, which is necessary for the evolutionary development. The 2 sciences can be also misunderstood, according to the same principle as law, value, fixed and variable. The outer left element falsely transfers esoteric concepts such as equality and fluid connections to biology and the physical reality. The outer right element falsely transfers physical inequalities and biological categorizations to law and morality. I will come back to how the sciences can be misinterpreted later. This is usually expressed in an ideology, and first it is still about why we perceive and evaluate the way we do, and about how it can happen at all that life develops, which is doing science. In order to recognize a reality, one must first perceive it. The possibilities to classify the environment lie in a spectrum between total categorization and total differentiation. Trees all look different, and yet we recognize them as trees. It is not about a fixed structure, but it must follow certain rules to be classified and perceived as a tree. The categories can become more holistic or more differentiated. If the allowed deviations are reduced, one would differentiate between types of trees. There would then be more potential categories: maple, oak, pine, or just trees. Pine, tree, and forest are different degrees of a spectrum between wholeness and differentiation. Things that are perceived and categorized are then also emotionally evaluated to cause a possible reaction to them. We are averse to eat rotten flesh because all died who were not. Affection and aversion are not synonyms for good and evil, but impulses enforced by evolution to avoid life-threatening situations and to strive for life-friendly conditions. Love is important, but love can also make blind. And hate can be very dangerous in political movements, but still there are reasons that we intuitively hate child molesters, because the chance of cutting down the family tree is drastically increased if the children are not protected from abuse. A rush to love quickly becomes a rush to hate. The more we love something, the more we hate something that is a threat to it. And the greater the threat, the more we love anything that might free us from that danger. That is why propagandists like to work with fear and enemy images, because then they can present themselves as the saviors from the threat. The greater the hatred and fear for the enemy image, the greater the love for the propagandist. When one is afraid of something, one behaves passively, and if one wants to overcome the fear, one needs to be brave, but not too much, because otherwise one becomes overconfident. One should never forget to be careful. Fear and overconfidence have in common that they offer the worst chances to be successful in the long run. We can also add the psychological states of mind, like depression and mania. Mental balance moves in an alternation of calmness and activity. In a bipolar disorder, it is a dual alternation of mania and depression. Collectivism or individualism? What is human nature? Are we selfless beings aiming to serve the common good? Or are we ruthless egoists who want nothing but to enrich ourselves? The nature of man cannot be one or the other, but must lie in the middle. This can also be proven, because a species which is too collectivist does not allow individual thoughts. Swarmfish and bees are too dependent on their collective. The further an individual deviates from the swarm behavior, the more the conditions are against it. It is more likely to be evolutionarily sorted out. In a too collectivist nature, individuals are dependent on not challenging the swarm behavior. If, on the other hand, the species is too individualist, individuals are always dependent on having to solve problems on their own, but no experience is passed on as knowledge in the collective. A species that successfully does science must be neither too collectivist nor too individualist. Individual experiences must be made intuitively passed on to their descendants. Since we are a species that does science, our nature must therefore lie in the middle. We have grown mentally beyond the animal because we can think up ideologies. And in the world of such ideologies, terms like authoritarian and anti-authoritarian are often understood in a very dual way. But both have two sides that can be interpreted in completely opposite poles. Anti-authoritarian can mean that one does not rise above anyone, but it can also mean subordination. Authoritarian can mean not being subordinate to anyone, but it can also mean rising above others. The more someone is superior, the more someone is subordinate. The more someone subordinates, the more someone is superior. One cannot exist without the other. They are two sides of the same synthesis. The anti-authority of one is always the authority of another. This is not only valid in the interaction between individuals, but also in the political visions. In the question of ideological control and totalitarianism, it does not matter whether one turns to authoritarian or anti-authoritarian ideology. Both sides become more and more totalitarian the further they move away from the center. Anti-authoritarian ideologies create positions of power by seeking and setting up strong leadership for collective properties. The state and the population are a bit like parent and child, a caring ideology with tendency to unconditional love, but only if one goes to bed in time, otherwise there's trouble. In the authoritarian ideology, state and population is like dog and breeder. The control is not for the well-being of the dog, but to make it as strong as possible. In extreme cases, low-grade dogs are castrated or even euthanized. Moral judgments are subjective and arise from a gut feeling. When one is more empathic, one perceives a connection to things and tends to a collectivist assumption. An unemotional view, on the other hand, sees more the self and would conclude an individualist nature. Such a cold lack of empathy is part of nature. We do not feel empathy for individual fruits that we want to eat. What would be the point? It would be simply evolutionary questionable. Personally, I used to go fishing. I can kill a big fish and gut it afterwards without much pity. It doesn't scream and has no facial features that trigger compassion in me. With a small mouse, I would have to overcome myself very much. When it squeals and screams, it behaves a bit like someone of my own species would scream and suffer. I have empathy with other people. My suffering through the suffering of others of my own species tempts me to avoid suffering in others. Many people feel the same, but not all. Only because of evolution, psychopathy is a marginal phenomenon in our society. Beyond evolution, this state of mind stands equal to what we perceive as human, but it was not profitable and always brought disadvantages. The spectrum of cold rationality up to total empathic relation is in this consideration primarily bound to the own species and is not about empathy to fish or fruits. There is something like negative and positive freedom. The freedom from something and the freedom to something. The elements equality in value, equality in law, freedom in value, and freedom in law serve different concepts of positive and negative freedom. The element on the far right means in negative total freedom from all laws, which is then total positive freedom to do anything. So freedom does not end when you mistreat someone else. Total negative freedom is total unrestricted positive freedom. To the left of this is a freedom from the state and command. It is a positive freedom to self-determination. One can determine his life only if one is free from need. And this is only if others enable one legal rights for help if one would be in need. Equality in value means that in positive freedom every person has the same claim to something. A right to equal wealth, regardless of any effort. No one is allowed to have more than someone else, which then means that no one has negative liberty rights, but all are subordinate to the collective. The natural synthesis would be equality of negative liberty rights on one hand and freedom and variation in positive liberty rights on the other. More simply, freedom ends when one restricts the freedom of another. Totalitarian systems are always a dual synthesis of a lawless leadership and a population deprived of all negative liberty rights. In economics, we find two major terms, socialism and capitalism. Also under it, different people often understand completely different things. Socialism is something collectivist and capitalism is something individualist. It is like public law or private law, solidarity or competition. There are two sides of both. If you ask a capitalism supporter, they usually see it as avoiding strong states through voluntary trade. The idea of socialism is then often associated with totalitarian planned economics. I also think it is true that without a free market, no free society can exist. However, this does not mean that a free market automatically means that individuals are free. For a market to function and to be fair, certain conditions must be fulfilled. In the capitalist vision, the state is seen as an aggressor that gives people the choice of serving the state or being captured by armed order followers who shoot if you resist. A bit like the duality of serve or be shot. All political truths are half-true. The argument that the state is an aggressor is correct, but it lacks the truth of the other vision to truly protect the free will fairly. If someone cannot refuse the contract because otherwise he would be in such a misery that he would starve, then he is not free in the decision. He could be forced to do many things that he does not want to because he is confronted with the choice of having to serve someone or die. If there are no alternatives and he cannot refuse without life-threatening consequences, then there is also no voluntariness. This allows us to contrast the voluntary elements with the unfree elements of the other side. This happens very often in political bubbles and makes many discussions very difficult when the concepts of capitalism and socialism are understood in such an inverted way. The perfect dictatorship works with the synthesis of the two external elements. A strong state from socialism and the creation and exploitation of existentially threatening emergency situations so that the population is pressured into having to follow orders against their will. This is something that we have just seen, for example, in the times of Corona, when the monopoly on the use of violence was used to force people across large areas and nations to choose between consuming the product of a pharmaceutical company or no longer being allowed to work. A scientific finding does not legitimize a right to rule. If I were proof that you could eat better, I would still not be allowed to force you to do so. Science is about describing the world. It is about finding out why things are the way they are. Science is not about telling others how they should be. It is not science to say that everyone must be vaccinated. To the concepts of socialism and capitalism also fit the positions on gun rights. The disarming of one is the arming of another. A totalitarian power always works with an unrestricted arsenal of weapons and a disarmed population. The middle here also lies somewhere between liberal gun rights and restrictions. I have tried to summarize many concepts under the elements. It should not be taken too exactly. For example, both totalitarian edges always work with the will to rule and collective duty ethics. Since the nature of a species becoming conscious is in the middle, individuals will diverge in both directions by evolution. Some tend toward community, others prefer to be alone. But this also means that they would give different answers to the question about the nature of their species and how it should organize itself socially. A society that is not aware about the nature of political visions is extremely vulnerable to political propaganda. If we would artificially divide the world into two binary poles, society would be divided into two dual parts with an inverted understanding of good and evil to each other. The world of ideologies is of course not binary but a fluid spectrum. Why individuals lean to the different elements can be better understood by going through them in a particular order. Right liberal is a thesis, and left liberal is the antithesis. Antithesis and thesis is also a bit like antitheism and theism. When the left vision overcomes the right liberal element by the monopoly of violence, the right vision moves to the far right, from the element air to water to earth to fire. The liberal right vision assumes that the state is not natural. That is correct. We didn't get this far evolutionary because we were centrally planned from above. We had to learn to manage on our own. That's why we started cooperating and coming up with cultural value systems, some of which have worked and some of which have not. States, through their intervention, have a destructive effect on independent life. Without the state, families and cultures are essential to live in peace and in social security. So, families and cultures exist because it was a disadvantage not to be part of a culture or family. But this does not mean that people who lose their family or who are not part of the culture have to be sorted out, which brings us to the antithesis. Because through the ability to think far ahead, our life conditions have changed. We trade with each other and we construct our environment. But all this does not always happen fairly. Emergency situations can be exploited, and to avoid them, helpfulness and solidarity are necessary. It is true that the classical family is important, but what is really bad about homosexual partnerships? They don't do anything to anyone. They provide themselves with social security, and why you should even interfere in other people's private lives. There's also no need to hold on to old values forever. These were never fixed, but always in a change. Sometimes you should just look ahead instead of preserving the traditional. I use the term Marxism here as the extremist form of the left wing. But there are individuals who see in it a concept of thesis plus antithesis equals synthesis, in order to find the anarchist middle from two opposite perspectives. People there are then also open to state control in order to protect self-determination. These people are in the left liberal element. But the idea that collective planning is legitimate for anarchy and the critique of the market quickly leads to an absolutism when viewed from a one-sided perspective. Cultural preservation and private law simply gets in the way of collective planning. For individuals, it is easy to see an enemy image in the opposition, because the well-intentioned ideas are constantly criticized. When the left vision overcomes the right liberal element, it moves to the far left element. Then the state is no longer used to protect individuals from ideologies, but to force individuals to serve the common good. It is no longer about achieving the equal right of free will. Instead, it is about achieving physical equality. So they transfer the esoteric concepts of equality and connectedness to the physical reality. Cultures are opposed to this equality. They are all judged in this perspective as an ideology which must be disregarded or even overcome by the state. The state takes over education and teaches children what is right and what is wrong. In such a society, families are superfluous. All sexual desires can be fulfilled without any consequences. If necessary, one can always have an abortion. Every moral idea which is brought together with universal equality leads to a totalitarian world state if it serves the positive right instead of the negative freedom rights. If a society moves towards an international Marxist government of physical equality, the right wing becomes more and more reactionary. There then rises a desire to restore old conditions with a counterpole totalitarianism. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. In extreme cases, this ends in barbaric breeding experiments. The more the state promotes its own culture, the more hostile it becomes to cultural minorities. The more the state promotes foreign cultures, the more destructive it becomes to its own culture. The left vision sees primarily the spectrum from multiculturalism to xenophobia. The right vision primarily sees the spectrum from hostility to their own people to cultural self-preservation. In the far left element, which is unfortunately very present in Germany, the destruction of its own culture is not perceived as a crime because it gets in the way of exoteric equality, which then again radicalizes the right vision. The more culture has been reshaped by the state, the greater the desire in the right wing that culture should be restored by the state. Crimes against people lie in the outer elements, and in order to prevent them, both visions should always be taken into mind to find balance. Interesting are also the ideas of sexuality and gender. In the right vision, people are viewed biologically. In biology, there are two sexes, which serve the purpose of reproduction. That is why people feel sexually attracted, so that they produce children. Then there are also such things as mental genders. This means mental principles which flow into each other. So such concepts with which I also work here. The metaphysics is universal, and so we find these mental genders not only in psychological characteristics, but also in structures or political visions. The concepts are actually genderless. The reason why biological men are associated with the masculine principle and biological women with the feminine principle is that by our nature, women tend to be leaning to the feminine and men to the masculine principle. So women tend to be more passive, empathic, collective, helpful, and holistic. Men tend more to competition, self-authority, and selfishness. However, due to natural variations, there are minorities: feminine men and masculine women. Sometimes this simply resulted from experience. But everyone is a synthesis of the feminine and masculine principle. Men are primarily in a masculine principle and secondary in the feminine, and with women it is the opposite. When it comes to the true origin of mental genders, there is no transgender minority, since everyone is a synthesis of the feminine and masculine principle. Expect Charles Manson, perhaps. He may have been binary in the masculine principle. So to summarize, normally men tend to the masculine principle and women to the feminine. But in the sum of many individuals, it is normal that feminine men and masculine women exist. Left liberal activism is about educating that deviations from the norm are natural. The opposite of the left liberal element is the far right element. There is the assumption that men must behave masculine and women must behave feminine. If this becomes an ideology, it manifests itself by enforcing stereotypical gender roles via the monopoly on violence. We find such attempts, for example, in Nazi Germany. The opposite of the right liberal element is a perversion of biology. There, the fluid principles are applied to sexuality, so transsexuality. People who are told that they are wrong because their mental principle does not correspond to the biological sex. Just like in the far right element. Only with the difference that not the mind must be aligned to the biology, but the biology must be aligned to the mind. Then hormones are taken artificially, or even the sex parts are mutilated so that they look similar to the other biological sex. This has nothing to do with naturalness and tolerance anymore, but it is a false reflection of metaphysical science. It is also interesting that in the political extremes, the visions are understood totally binary. So one believes in the far left not only in fluid biological sexes, but also in the idea that political left and right are binary, so a total inversion of nature. Since it is not longer accepted there that man and woman strike out into the other mental gender, it is actually also in contradiction to the left liberal element. The differentiation between the liberal and the ideological elements of the left and right wing does not take place in the majority. As a result, there is a problem. In the LGBT community, homosexual partnerships are categorized with transsexual propaganda and BDSM fetishes. The framing and dual splitting of visions is the most effective tool for psychological manipulation of masses. If the right wing now reacts reactionary to LGBT propaganda, it becomes an easily controlled opposition. On the one hand, their criticism of the far left element is absolutely justified. On the other hand, the framing of homosexuals with perverted fetishes and schizophrenic alternative egos creates a subconscious connection. This not only ensures that in the right wing the idea arises to ban any deviant sexuality, it also creates a real homophobia. This then makes the left-wing criticism of the right-wing correct, which in turn allows them to strengthen themselves in the duality that the left wing would be good and the right wing would be evil, which in turn makes the right wing more radicalized. The two visions radicalize and depend on each other for the activism by being the other's enemy image. It is always best to keep the things as simple as possible. Therefore, I now reduce the elements to two characteristics. Right liberal looks mainly at freedom from the state and therefore tends to economic freedoms, so freedom and independence in physical reality. Left liberal looks mainly at cultural freedoms and tends to the idea of equality and universal human rights. When people don't understand the nature of political visions, they tend to fall into a duality. The two left or the two right elements are then combined. The cosine then shifts to the sine. The left wing then serves metaphysical and physical equality and connectedness. It is then cultural free but economics are controlled. The right wing then serves metaphysical and physical freedom and inequality. It is then economically free but the culture is controlled. The two one-eyed views are completely inverted in their vision and have nothing in common. But since both are half right and half wrong, these can easily confirm each other in their dual worldview that one wing would be good and the other wing would be evil. And when they get more and more into the fight of good versus evil, both sides not only become one-eyed, but fall into total ideological blindness. Both then serve a dual synthesis of external elements. The left and the right extremism operates with a controlled culture and economy. Likewise, both serve an inverted metaphysics of nature by enforcing variable laws via totalitarian violence to enforce ideological values in society. So it is like the horseshoe principle. The square arrangement can also be found in the political compass. The only difference is that in my representation, libertarianism is at the top and totalitarianism is at the bottom. Most of the time, people put the left wing versus the right wing. But what is most interesting is an inside versus an outside, libertarian polarity versus totalitarian duality. Any imperialist ideology will deny the self-authority of the individuals. By the unity preached by the monopoly of violence, one can read the claim to rule and see how high the Tower of Babel has already been built. Fascism is somewhat more difficult to classify here, since it wants to establish the national degree via global totalitarianism. The idea gets more popular when the monopoly on violence is centralized globally, serving the one-sided left vision. It is of course not a problem if people define themselves by their national culture or as citizens of the world. It only becomes a problem when it becomes an ideology. Voluntary global communication is an important element of education, and prejudice only stands in the way. The stronger the state, the more the conflicts increase and the society divides into two groups. One which is subordinated to the system and one which is critical of the state. The political climate heats up. The stronger the state, the greater the fear that the opposition will take over the monopoly on violence. Everything becomes more tense and dangerous. At the same time, globalization reduces the possibility of finding a safe region if we are politically persecuted as an opposition member. We are moving further and further towards to that. The West serves the far left element, the far right element of reactionism we find in Russia. There are two sides calling each other dangerous imperialist ideologues, and both are right. The West is clearly pushing an imperialist and unscientific ideology. I would like to clearly distance myself from both sides here. I consider the heating up of the political climate to be far more threatening than climate change. This does not mean that climate change is not a threat, but the political climate collapses in the world war. Then no one will be interested in the planet's ecology and our environment anymore. Moral values are subjective and evolve under certain conditions. Morality then in turn changes the conditions, which in turn changes the morality again. No one has constructed us, but we have evolved over a long period of time. In my philosophy, I am guided by the elements of equality in value, equality in law, freedom in value, and freedom in law. These are not only archetypes in which we find the moral concepts of political visions, but in them we also find structures, orders, and the living conditions that go along with them. Scientific life begins in freedom from external planning. One seeks for more time, through a longer life or simplification and perfection of life-simplifying services, processes, and objects. When no one is there to save you, helpfulness, self-responsibility, and family cooperation is an advantage. This morality creates more security. This eliminates hardship and suffering in society. A fair condition of life is created, because it is no longer necessary to act out of misery. Under this life condition, the states and its interventions become more normal for each following generation. Arguments for the classical family lose more and more weight when the state provides basic care. If natural law is not understood as a negative right of freedom, individuals who fight for more justice also tend to achieve more equality and positive freedoms, which can only be achieved through the monopoly on violence. More equality of positive legal rights in the collective always means more positive freedom to rule for the state. The state is in its science, morality, life condition, enforcement, and basically in its entire metaphysics the opposite of the metaphysics of nature, the natural science, and the life condition which has produced minds striving for knowledge. Helpfulness and self-defense it replaces with duty ethics enforced by violence. Instead of objective laws of nature and subjective values and evaluations, the state declares values as objective via false science, in order to establish them with imaginary laws. The state plans centrally, and natural life develops decentrally out of itself. In a statist society, much becomes final. Life paths are already predefined and only have to be learned by memory and then repeated eternally. A centrally planned society of predefined life paths lets the individuals not only become depressed, they also never learn to grow up. The state becomes a family. The state turns many small organisms into one large entity, a single organism. The monopoly on violence centralizes and spreads like cancer. Static structures wear out sooner or later, and when everything is physically connected, individual collapses provide potential chain reactions. A collapse of the system becomes more and more probable and fatal the stronger and more widespread the state's central planning takes place. When a system comes to end, more and more problems arise and more individuals reject the state. When the state dies, social chaos potentially breaks out. Barbaric conditions arise. The rise and fall of a fascist revolution starts a final end. After the collapse, only rubble remains. In these, individuals are left to their own and are again dependent on family, helpfulness, and self-responsibility. The circle is closed. Everything to the beginning. Rebirth. If a society is not aware of this, it is doomed to go through an eternal cycle of rise, age, fall, death, and rebirth of totalitarian systems. I believe that this cycle is so archetypal that in it lies a great filter that prevents a species making the leap into consciousness. Only through the conscious decision to live in harmony with the moral laws of nature can this filter be overcome. But in order to do so, one must first recognize it. Natural laws are enforced by inescapable consequences over which no one has any influence. They work regardless of whether one believes in them or not. That a society collapses sooner or later if it moves away from the free will and submits to the totalitarianism is an unavoidable consequence. It is as if the nature would not allow any species to develop into higher consciousness if it does not orient itself at the free will. Then it will slowly be guided out of consciousness until society collapses. Laws like that people lose their job if they are not vaccinated, or that people are not allowed to see their family on holidays, are ideological laws, which are enforced over artificial consequences and the monopoly of violence. They are not scientific laws. If one thinks this is science, one lives in imagination land. Then one has an inverted understanding of science and nature. It is a metaphysical schizophrenia in which one cannot differentiate science and fantasy. For me, it was a bit confusing on which side to put altruism and egoism. Which of these fits more with chaos and which with order? So cold self-interest and authoritarian behavior I would put to order. Warm, empathic external interest and humble behavior as characteristics of chaos. But with morality, the empathic ones are again leaning towards order, and cold-minded individuals tend towards lawless morality. There's a pattern behind this as well. Let's take the concepts of law and value for orientation. Mathematical laws are universal, eternal, and superior to value. Mathematical values are variable, infinite, and subordinated to the law. The first level is the mental basis. In it we find the mental spectrum and also the concepts of the two hemispheres of the brain. From the mental basis, an individual sense of justice arises, in which order and chaos are inverted. An empathic mind tends to moral laws in dealing with others. A rational mind to moral lawlessness. The moral assumption then decides the action. A moral mind subordinates itself to moral laws, just as mathematical value is subordinated to the law. A lawless morality, on the other hand, puts oneself above others in order to shape them according to one's own will. Social orders arise from the actions. If all follow the cold self-interest, chaotic conditions in the right of the strongest arise. If all subordinate themselves to the collective, static structures appear like in a beehive. But now let's go a little deeper into the mind and its possibilities. Minds, which grow evolutionary, function according to a similar principle as an ordinary application for the computer. There's an input which receives information, a logical inner process, and an output for information. Eyes, ears, buttons, and sensors are all different things that perform the same process. They all serve to receive information. The difference between a computer and a living algorithm is that in an application the information is entered to produce an output in the service of the commanding entity. An application has no will of its own and is in the service of the user. A living and organic algorithm is serving its own self. What must one be conscious about in order to have a consciousness? Where between a single-celled organism, a bug, a dog, an average human, Goethe and beyond? Where does it begin? Does it begin with the realization that one exists? Or with the realization that one will one day no longer exist? Is there perhaps no exactly definable point at which consciousness begins? Is it blurred at the beginning and becomes clearer with increasing ability? Between pure unconsciousness and an algorithm that can become conscious about everything, there is also a spectrum. As a basis for the interests of action, I use a spectrum between self-interest and external interest. But to better understand the possibilities of mental abilities, we need more dimensions. In the three axes lie the abilities to make decisions as a free independent will, the WQ, the rational abilities to analyze events and make logical conclusions, the IQ, and the ability to put oneself emotionally into others or the ability to perceive a connectedness behind things, the EQ. If we put the axis in a three-dimensional spectrum, we get a mental cube that no one can leave. Near the lower corner, at 0, 0, 0, lie the simple algorithms functioning according to impulses, whose motives can be understood very easily. On the other hand, the highest extreme, 1, 1, 1, would be a completely independent will with extremely high rational abilities, which follows a moral principle through the suffering in the suffering of others, which serves the sustainable existence of life. The free will can never be really high in simple functioning organisms with a low IQ. By observing their behavior, future behavior can be easily predicted and controlled. However, a high IQ does not necessarily entail an independent will. A computer can calculate complex numbers faster than a beer, but a computer does not live and exist by itself. It calculates predefined algorithms. A computer has a much higher mathematical IQ than a beer, but its WQ and EQ is 0, which makes it smarter but easier to control. The WQ determines the programmability or possibility that it can be controlled by a conscious planning life. A crow that uses branches as a tool to fish insects out of branch holes is more aware of itself and the environment than the insects it catches. If we draw a line between 0, 0, 0 and 1, 1, 1, we get the shortest path from simple impulses to the total ability of self-awareness. At the very bottom of the graph are simple microorganisms. There, the question of self-interest and external interest does not yet play a major role. If we move further up into the instinctive unconscious principles, we find actions in orders of animals which have not yet reached a higher rational mind. So they don't do science yet and stay in their natural environment from generation to generation. This includes everything between impulses and knowledge gathering. Wolves, mice, snakes, birds, bees, elephants, these occupy different degrees in the question of cognitive ability and individualistic or collectivistic ways of life. Let us assign more properties to the two-dimensional spectrum. But these should not be considered binary or static. Individuals move through the spectrum in their lives with tendencies that are influenced by their nature and experience. All start at the bottom at 0, 0, 0 as they slowly develop from a fetus. It also depends on mood, or who or what the individual relates to. Think of it more as a small vibrating dot, half of whose tendencies are determined by evolution and the other half by individual experience. a blank page with a basic framework set by evolution printed on its back, which influences the ways in which one responds to certain events and according to which sense of justice is acted on. A beetle is determined by its nature never to leave the unconscious mind level. Subconscious individuals rationalize their unconscious sensations to themselves as the right decision, which is prone to errors. The higher something is on the mental spectrum, the more likely a subconscious impulse is to be recognized as that. Altruistic traits are subordinate and thus open to learning new things. Individuals with less empathy have the advantage of having to overcome less emotion to think certain thoughts. At the mental left extreme is a spectrum between a far-sighted and a short-sighted psychopath. The short-sighted psychopath is found in planless acts for self-enrichment. For example, robbers, blackmailers, thieves, etc. Robbing a small market or robbing an old woman may bring short-term success, but in the long run, failure becomes more likely. A far-sighted psychopath acts with foresight and has special advantages in the competition for positions of power due to the increased intelligence in combination with a moral lawlessness, compared to someone who would be too honest and exclude certain strategies due to moral principles. In the right mind, there is a spectrum between a far-sighted and a short-sighted altruist. The short-sighted altruist is not fully aware of the self and the nature of reality, and has a naive understanding of the world that does not take into account that the individuals who advertise to be followed and elected as leaders may not be altruist at all, but that they may be very intelligent and manipulative individuals without empathy who may exploit ignorance of emotional people to enrich themselves. A child's view of the world that would immediately get into the car with someone luring them with puppy dogs and candy. The far-sighted altruist is aware of his own emotions and is able to look at them from the outside and overcome them without overcoming the moral sense of justice. Someone who thinks in the long term, who is hard to manipulate, and who voluntarily sacrifices himself for others. When life makes a leap from the unconscious to the subconscious state and begins to do science, the species is in the middle range. That's where we stand as human beings. We are a subconscious species. We are smart enough to shape the environment and come up with ideologies, but not smart enough to understand the long-term consequences. Life that becomes conscious must choose polarity if it does not want to decay. Duality inverts the conditions that created a conscious and moral mind. That is why exactly the opposite states of mind become the advantage. Naivety, narcissism, sadism, masochism are escorted by a mental decay into unconsciousness. We should not only look at the dangers of a psychopath. The rash to desire to slaughter others is the opposite to the desire to be slaughtered. There is also something like that. For example, in the story of the cannibal of Rothenburg and its victim. Such mental extremes exist only so rarely because it does not bring any advantages in the polarity. In a reality beyond evolution, such mental states stand indifferently beside helpfulness and self-preservation. Through duality and totalitarianism, a society travels behind the event horizon of mental possibilities. Then sadistic and masochistic behavior becomes normal. Then there is torture, shooting, serving, and killing. Normally, all people who care about the sustainable existence of the planet and the survival of humanity would choose polarity, but only if they are conscious about it. Unfortunately, most of them are not. Because most of them are not aware of the natural law and the long-term consequences, their empathy can be easily manipulated and used for political propaganda. When an empathic mind reaches a higher level of understanding, its empathy also binds itself to something more far-reaching and higher. It is an alchemical transmutation from the humble element of water to something nobler, so to wine. Then one enters the mental conscious plane. But standing there does not mean that one is a good person. It is about rational mental knowledge, and one can use it to help others, but one could also enrich oneself by using it against others. I use here the terms of the path of the left and the right hand. These are already used in different occult movements. In the left hand, Satanism and the duality is classified. Personal anarchism, which knows no laws and which needs on the other side a dual counterpole, which is mentally manipulated and programmed. In the path of the right hand, it is about social anarchism, which is oriented to universal and not man-made natural laws. Under the right hand, we find the Hermetic and Abrahamic religions. It is about bringing the species into consciousness. The concepts of the path are a duality, but the right one is about avoiding duality, a self-sacrifice to protect society from collapse and to keep it in polarity. The self-sacrifice of the right hand becomes unnecessary once the species has made the leap into consciousness and chooses to live in polarity. What is the self? I can only answer this question from my perspective. I have gone through mental stages in my development, for which I can also use the elements. First, I was in the element earth. I had a material understanding of myself. That was for me my body. Sometimes also a little bit the things I own. When I started thinking about the self, I realized that I am not my body. I am a mind in this body. The body is a vehicle that my mind has borrowed. I am not my hands or my eyes, but the thinking that controls them. By now, however, I understand that when I look at a tree, I don't really see the tree. I see some kind of hologram created by my mind, by the information I take in with my senses. I see the inside of a pattern processing algorithm from a non-physical dimension. Even in a video game, a character may bump into walls, but it is still an algorithm. It is a logical and non-physical chain of reaction moving through a large information grid. I think that nature is a huge algorithm in which many smaller algorithms grow. The physical interaction between things is part of the code of nature. Our mind takes the data of nature through our senses and reflects our environment, like a mirror made of logic decoding data into a hologram. I don't think you can walk through walls by changing your mindset. If this were possible in nature's code, it would be too chaotic to bring up complex brains capable of reflecting the environment. So I do not see reality, but only what my mind constructs from it. An algorithm does not have to be looked at from the inside. It can calculate without a monitor being connected to it. But if one is connected, is one connected? If a tree falls and someone is standing next to it and sees it, is someone standing next to it and sees it? If an organic algorithm creates an hologram that is observed from the inside, is it observed from the inside? Yes. And I know that more than I know that everything around me really exists as I perceive it. I am an observation in my mind, which has also observed long before my mind has reflected and recognized the observation. Imagine in your computer a calculation takes place, and behind this logical chain reaction stands beyond the physical reality an observation which can look only over such a chain reaction into this reality. So it feels for me if I think about it too long, as if I would be such an observation in a non-physical reality, which looks into the reality by logical chain reactions. And that is the only thing I really know is real. The physical world seems so distant to me because I know that the only thing connecting me to the physical reality is a hologram created by my mind. But what I don't understand is, where am I? Where is the place from which I look into the non-physical chain reaction of my mind? What is the nature of that? Is my individual observation like the single facet of an eye with many other observations? I don't know if it's like that for everyone. Maybe other people can't listen themselves think. The realization of this is then probably in the element fire. I cannot answer it. I only know myself. When society falls into duality and goes through the eternal cycle, duality happens in the large and in the small scale. When the state moves into the element of power, the population loses self-authority and becomes obligated to serve. The individual minds that are trapped in the system tend to a duality of naivety and arrogance in order to maintain their own political duality. In addition, a social split is taking place between those who trust the system and subordinate themselves in an anti-authoritarian way, and those who distrust the state and do not want to give up their self-authority for such a system. A totalitarian society lives under inverted natural laws. The concepts of equality and freedom invert and shift outward. A state creates an inverted and dual nature. This creates a duality between people and the state, which in turn splits the political visions of the people, which is why the individuals become more and more dual inside. The only way out is the way in. Only when a society collectively becomes aware of the moral law of nature can the cycle be overcome. But the problem is that many don't want to know, because the state has become a cult. Such a radical cult often ends rather like Jonestown than that all at once quite self-critically admit that they have fallen for a dangerous and unscientific delusion. One can ignore the existence of moral laws of nature and the right to a free will, but not the consequences that occur when one tries to overcome nature by an inverted metaphysics. If a species would have made it through the Great Filter and would be a million years ahead of us in science, it must have consciously chosen a voluntary morality and an organic social system at some point. Then the mental basis would be close to the inner center, so a high rationality and empathy. If they would land on a planet like Earth with a species that does not value free will, they wouldn't know if we would try to take over the ship, perform experiments on them, or if we would just try to destroy them. Humanity would appear to a truly conscious species as a monkey appears to us, primitive, and it is unclear if we will make the leap from subconscious to conscious. Only if we would break the circle. And I think we will. It may look hopeless right now, but to see the dawn, one must wake up when it's still dark outside. At the moment, the emotions of the masses are drifting mostly unconsciously in the conflicts of visions, without being aware of the nature of dual worldviews. The cycle is archetypal. The special thing about this situation is that we go through it synchronized. We value science and we communicate freely through the internet. We are becoming conscious together, globally. In the whole period of a species, from the emergence of unicellular organisms to total consciousness, we are at the most interesting point. We are standing at exactly this one situation, somewhere within this time window, where minds start to truly question the nature of reality. Making the leap into consciousness is like the birth of a new species, which has been moving for countless of years, but it was never truly alive in mind. Will-less processes develop an individual will, and the sixth sense, the mind, starts to question itself. If we would try to simulate consciousness, it would be most interesting exactly when the algorithm starts to understand the logical structure of its environment and its inner self. Of all the ages that evolutionary life passes through, the here and now is the most interesting in the question of self-realization and consciousness. If one would simulate consciousness, then exactly because of this event, because of the moment when an algorithm recognizes itself.